The world was snow-muffled when she found him. It was the third winter since her return to the hollow by Opossum Creek, where the sycamores leaned like old men tired of standing, and the water whispered things she'd once known how to listen for. Her cabin, hewn from scavenged timber and chinked with clay and moss, stood like a memory among the trees, with smoke unfurling gentle and gray from its crooked chimney. Here, Creek woman lived quiet, her days stitched together by silence and small, steady labors. She made her bread from cornmeal and rendered bare fat for her lamps. She sang only when the fire was low and no one could hear. She'd taken the name back for herself when she came home, Creek woman. Before the war she had been called other things. Anna, Miss Fairchild, the doctor's wife, the teacher from Charleston, each name a shedding. But now there was only this, the woman who walked the water's edge in deer-hide boots, her dark braid looped twice at the nape of her neck, and her heart cinched tight as a poultice. The morning she found the man, she'd gone to check her traps strung along the southern bend. Snowflakes danced like sifted flour, and the trees stood still as if listening. The air held that iron hush that comes before storm. She saw the crows first, 4 of them, hunched and waiting on a limb. They did not scatter when she stepped into the clearing. That was strange. She smelled blood before she saw the body. He lay on his side beside the creek, one leg twisted beneath him, his greatcoat soaked through and dark with frost. A soldier, or what was left of one. No rifle, no pack, just a slumped heap of man and wool and ruin. His boots were cracked to ruin and his beard had gone to bramble. At first she thought he was dead. She crouched low, studying the rise of his back beneath the coat. It moved, slow as snowmelt. Alive. She did not speak, did not call out. Words had a way of echoing too far in the woods. Instead, she knelt beside him and slid her hands beneath his shoulders. His skin burned through the fabric with fever. He made no sound, only a soft clench of jaw and a tremble like a colt learning to stand. His eyes opened once, but did not seem to see her. Creek woman gathered what strength she had, hooked her arms beneath his, and dragged him through the snow. It took the better part of an hour to get him back to the cabin. The sled was too far and too heavy to fetch, and she would not risk leaving him. So she dragged, until the ground behind them bore a trail of churned white and red. The trees watched, the crows followed. By the time she got him to the hearth, her hands were raw, and her breath came in sobs she refused to name. She stripped his coat, his boots, his stiffened shirt, all crusted with blood and dirt, and things she did not want to see. She found the wound, just below the ribs, torn ragged like it had been made by shrapnel or a rusted blade, and she cleaned it with whiskey and boiled water. He did not flinch, did not scream, only turned his face to the wall like it pained him to be looked at. He would not speak, not that day, nor the next, nor the ones that followed. She called him Hollow Man, though not aloud. The name shaped itself in her mind like a stone in a riverbed. He was all silence and broken places, a vessel emptied by whatever hell he'd crawled through to find her. Days passed, snow grew deeper, the forest pressed in. She nursed him as she would a wounded animal, with clean linens and soft broth and silence. When the fever broke, he opened his eyes and followed her with them, but still no words, not even a whisper. Sometimes she found him sitting up at night, staring at the flames with a look that chilled her worse than any wind. A look that said he'd seen things he could never name. She did not press him. She knew the weight of buried things, knew how some wounds closed over without ever healing. Instead, she waited, worked, sang low in the mornings when she thought he still slept, songs in the old tongue her mother had sung while braiding her hair. One morning while chopping kindling, she saw him outside, standing in the snow barefoot, his eyes lifted to the sky, not lost but listening. She stepped quietly beside him, no questions, no demands. He looked at her once as if seeing her for the first time. His lips moved, but no sound came. Creek woman only nodded. She understood. The words would come when they were ready. And perhaps when they did, so would hers. The thaw came slow that year. March crept in with sullen rains and nights that clung still to frost. The snow softened into slush, and the creek, long muffled, found its voice again, hoarse and muttering, like an old man woken too soon. Trees shook off their shrouds drip by drip, and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth remembering itself. By then he could walk, though his limbs moved with the stiffness of disuse and the ghost of pain. She watched him pace the line between cabin and wood's edge, always stopping short of the trees as if there were things beyond he could not bear to meet. He moved like a man unsure of his own shape, pausing often to listen, not for birdsong or squirrel chatter, but for sounds long past. Cannons, perhaps, or the scream of iron on flesh. Creek woman said nothing of it. She had no wish to name what hollowed him. The land had seen enough ghosts without her stirring more. Instead, she gave him work. First the easy things, fetching water, turning the soil by the shed, oiling the hinges on the trapdoor that led to her root cellar. He took to these tasks with a quiet sort of precision, as though the doing mattered more than the purpose. She noticed how he touched every tool with care, running his fingers over the grain of the handles like one might trace a scar. Later, when her shoulder ached too fierce to lift the chopping maul, he split logs for her. He stood out there for hours, sleeves rolled and breath pluming in the cold, working without pause. He moved like a man trying to remember something in the shape of his own body. One evening, after he had stacked the last of the winterwood, she brought him a cup of sassafras tea, still warm from the pot. He took it with a nod, their fingers brushing at the rim. She thought she saw something then, a flicker behind his eyes, quick as the glint of mica in creekstone, not recognition, not desire, but something quieter, the kind of noticing that didn't ask or expect. She said, "You've a good swing," and turned away before the silence could swallow them both. The days began to fill, not with speech but with rhythm. He set snares while she patched netting. He mended a broken step on the porch without being asked. When the wild onions pushed through the thawed loam, they gathered them side by side, their knees brushing in the soft dirt, and she taught him how to roast them in the coals until they sang sweet. At night he would sit near the fire, whittling small figures from pine scrap, animals mostly. Once a bird, its wings half-carved, unfinished. She watched the shavings fall to his boots, thin as parchment curls. He never wrote, never gestured to ask for paper. But sometimes, when the wind howled too close or thunder rolled low on the horizon, he would go still, all breath held. And in those moments she saw it. What war had taken from him wasn't only speech. It was trust, the kind that let a man rest easy in the world, unguarded. She knew something of that. Her own past was a locked room she seldom entered. But some nights, when the whiskey burned just right and the ache in her shoulder eased, she would remember. The child she hadn't kept, the letters that came late, the marriage that dissolved like salt in rain. So she did not press. Instead, she began to read aloud. At first it was small things, the Psalms, a passage from an old ledger she'd once used to teach the town's children. Later, poems from a weathered book she'd salvaged years ago, its spine cracked and pages foxed. She read to the room more than to him, yet always she felt his listening. One night, while reading an old Cherokee tale of stars born from lovers lost in the dark, she caught his eyes reflecting firelight, wet, unblinking. She closed the book and said nothing, just let the silence fall like snow between them. Spring broke open one morning with a suddenness that felt violent. One day there was frost, the next, the ground steamed, and the air buzzed with gnats and green things clawing their way back to life. He began to speak in his own way then, not with words but with acts. He built a smokehouse from fallen cedar, cleaned the chimney without prompting, found her old fiddle, long silent beneath the bed, and brought it to her hands without asking, as if daring her to remember how it once sang. She did not play it, not yet. But she touched the strings. And for the first time in many seasons, Creek woman felt the old stirrings beneath her ribs, not joy exactly, but the shape joy might take if given time. Still the words remained buried, hers and his alike. But seeds do not bloom on command. They wait, they root in silence. Then when they are ready, they rise. By summer, the land had gone wild with color. Goldenrod swept the edges of the field like fire-licking sky, and the blackberries came on thick and stubborn, staining hands and lips alike. The creek ran warm and fast, its banks lush with fern and popple bloom. It was a season of plenty, and for the first time in years, Creek woman felt the old rhythm return, the bone-deep knowing that life, despite everything, continued. The man, too, had changed with the season. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds or stared long into the trees. His body had thickened with labor, his arms bronzed by sun, his silences less like stone and more like soil, deep, fertile, waiting. Still, no voice came, but she learned to read him in other ways. The way his hands tensed at the sight of uniformed men passing the ridge trail, or how he turned his face when the sky burned red at dusk, as though the color reminded him of something too near. They did not speak of the war. What was there to say? She could see the map of it on his skin, in the long white scar that laced his ribs, in the way he sometimes bolted upright in the night, mouth open in a scream he could not give voice to. She knew enough not to touch him then, only to sit nearby, the fire low, the room warm with the scent of juniper and pine sap, until the terror left him. One morning, she took him fishing. They hiked along the North Fork, where the water ran narrow and fast, shaded by alder and maple. She handed him a line wrapped around a driftwood spool, showed him how to bait it with the soft belly of a beetle, and they stood there together, knee-deep in current. He caught the first fish. A smallmouth bass, silver-backed and fierce, that thrashed wild against the line. When he pulled it in, he held it up with both hands, eyes wide not with pride, but with wonder, as if he'd forgotten a world existed that still offered gifts. She laughed then, an honest, unguarded sound that startled even her, and he looked at her with something close to a smile. They fried the catch in a skillet over open flame, the skin crisping to gold, and ate side by side on a flat rock, bare feet in the stream. It felt like something old returning, not happiness exactly, but the memory of it. That night he touched her for the first time. Not in hunger, not in need, just his hand on hers, a resting thing, warm and certain, no demand in it, no sorrow, just presence. She did not pull away. The days shortened as they always did, and the harvest called. Together they gathered what the land had given, squash and beans, sweet corn and wild greens, the last of the honey before the bees tucked in. He built a second shed, repaired the roof that had long needed mending, and began crafting things she hadn't asked for. A small bench for the hearth, a spoon carved from walnut, the beginnings of a cradle with no child to fill it. She said nothing of that last one, only watched his hands work, the gentleness in them. Then came the day he returned from the woods with blood on his shirt and a wildness in his eyes. It was near dusk. She was stringing beans to dry, her fingers slick with their green juice when he stumbled into the yard. His chest heaved, mouth open, but still no words. He grasped her arm, pointed behind him, then let go and dropped to his knees. She went with her rifle. Half a mile out by the ridge where the pines grew dense, she found the trail. Broken branches, scuffed dirt, a spatter of blood, then the boy. He was no older than 14. Pale as bone, dressed in the remnants of Confederate gray, his leg twisted beneath him. The wound was fresh and wrong, something caught in a trap or torn in a fall. He blinked up at her with fevered eyes, said something she couldn't make out. She looked back once toward the cabin, knowing what it would cost. Then she lifted him in her arms and carried him home. The man helped her dress the wound. He boiled water, fetched linens, did everything she could not say aloud. The boy writhed and moaned, babbling nonsense. Somewhere in the haze, he called for his mother. Creek woman wiped his brow with a rag soaked in mint tea. Her hands did not shake. 3 days passed in a fog of sweat and prayer. On the 4th, the boy opened his eyes and wept. It was then that the man spoke. Just one word. Zephyr. Rough, hoarse, broken as old wood, but it came from his mouth like a flood from a split dam. She turned to him, heart thudding. He did not speak again that night, but in the days that followed, words began to trickle back. Names, numbers, a song half-remembered from childhood. She never asked what broke him, but now she knew what began to mend him. It wasn't the safety. It was the choice to give it. And somewhere in the soft folds of that summer, amid the fireflies and the cry of nightjars, Creek woman felt the long-buried syllables of her own name stir in the dark, aching to be heard once more. Autumn came sudden and gold. It laid itself down over the hollow like a quilt, the kind stitched by hand and heavy with memory. Leaves turned all at once, brilliant and brittle, and the air carried that thin, clean sharpness that speaks of endings. Squirrels grew frantic in the branches. Geese passed overhead in ragged skeins, their cries stretching long across the sky. The boy, whose name turned out to be Eli, healed slowly but true. He was skittish at first, flinching from every creak and snap of twig. But the warmth of the cabin, the broth, the gentle patience of Creek woman and the man, these drew him in like coals drawing breath. He spoke little, but his eyes followed everything. His wound left a limp he would carry always, but it was his spirit that worried her more. There was a vacancy behind his stare some days, a hollow too like the one she'd seen in the man when he'd first come crawling out of the woods. Still he worked when asked, learned to salt meat and mend nets, how to listen for deer before they broke the brush. Creek woman taught him to tie knots and weave baskets from river cane. It gave him something to hold. The man, his voice coming easier now, taught him how to sharpen a blade, how to read the sky before rain, when to speak, and more often when not to. They did not ask where the boy came from. His uniform said enough. What mattered was that he stayed. Together, the three of them became something that moved like family, though the word was never said. They took meals at the same table, mended fences, laughed sometimes at things not even funny. The man would hum when he worked now, tuneless and low, but constant, a sound that filled the air like smoke from a hearth. One evening, after the first hard frost, Creek woman pulled the fiddle from beneath her bed. She did not speak as she rosined the bow. Her hands moved steady, though her throat clenched tight. She had not played since before the fire, before the letter, before her voice had folded into itself like a bird beneath snow. She drew the bow across the strings once, twice, letting the sound crack the hush. It was thin at first, dry as wind through dead grass, but then slowly the tone deepened, took root, became whole. The tune she chose had no name. It rose from her hands like something remembered from before language. A song carried in the bones, a song of mourning, perhaps, or mercy. The boy sat motionless, eyes wide. The man did not look at her, only closed his eyes and leaned back against the wall, as if letting the sound move through him. She played until the fire dipped low, until her fingers ached, and the music had drawn out all the old ache from the corners of her chest. When she finished, no one clapped, no one needed to. That night she dreamt of a river, wide and black, and on the far bank stood a woman she barely recognized, with hair loose and eyes full of something like peace. The woman nodded once and turned, walking back into the trees. In the days that followed, the man spoke more, not about the war but about small things, a dog he'd once kept, the taste of peaches from a Georgia orchard, how to tell if wood would split by its grain. He spoke to Eli most, but Creek woman listened from the corner, gathering his stories like kindling. Then came the letter. It arrived strapped to the leg of a dust-colored pony that trotted up the trail near dusk, riderless but not lost. Creek woman saw the brand on its flank and knew it from town. It had come from the old postmaster, miles downriver, who still held on to the ritual of sending messages through the hills when the road was washed or watched. The man opened it with a blade. His face did not change as he read. When he finished, he folded the paper twice and slid it into his boot. That night he did not sleep. She heard the cabin boards creak beneath his pacing, heard the door open once and the hush that followed. In the morning, she found him by the creek, sleeves rolled, hands soaked to the wrist in cold water. He looked at her, then to the ground. "They found my name," he said, voice low. "Want me to testify, Richmond." She nodded once, waited. Said I could come, or not, no charge against me, just stories they want told. His eyes found hers then, raw and open. "I don't know what's mine to say." She stepped beside him, close enough to feel his heat in the crisp air. "You don't owe them," she said, "but maybe you owe yourself." He didn't speak, just looked down at his hands. She could see the choice in him, growing heavy. That night, as the fire curled in the hearth, and the boy slept on his cot by the door, Creek woman found herself reaching for her own buried voice. Words she had held back, salted down like meat for winter. She turned to the man. Her hand touched the cradle he'd built months before, still empty. "I had a daughter," she said, the words brittle, unfamiliar on her tongue. "Died before she had a name." He looked at her, not with pity, but with that same quiet recognition he'd shown her the first day he could stand. "I buried her near the sycamore," she added. "Years ago, never told a soul." His hand came to rest on hers. No questions, no sorrow, just the weight of being known. Outside, the wind shifted. The first leaves began to fall. The journey was not decided in words. They rose early one morning before frost had left the grass, packed a small satchel with dried apples, hard bread, and salt meat. The man strapped his coat tight and wrapped a scarf around Eli's shoulders. Creek woman watched him move with a quiet purpose, as if the choice had formed not from the letter, but from the land itself, rooted, inevitable. She did not go with them, not at first. The hollow needed tending, and winter would not wait. She handed the man a parcel of dried herbs, another of coiled birch bark and black cohosh, remedies for sleep, for fever, for grief. Eli stood close beside her as they said goodbye, though none of them named it so. The boy hugged her without asking. She had not wept when he came, nor when he'd nearly died. But his arms around her now, thin and certain, stirred something deeper than sorrow. She held him long, then stepped back and said only, "Come home when the ground thaws." The man did not promise. He only met her gaze, hand resting on the hilt of the knife he now carried always. The look in his eyes was not fear, but memory, sharp and full, and something else beneath that, hope perhaps, or its shadow. They left as the sun breached the ridge, two figures moving slow along the river trail, one tall and steady, the other limping but unbroken. Days passed like smoke. Creek woman returned to her quiet. She chopped wood, canned what remained of the garden, scrubbed the hearth until her hands cracked. The wind picked up, and the geese no longer passed overhead. The sky grew mean and low, a leaden dome over the hollow. She spoke aloud sometimes, just to hear her voice in the stillness. Read the Psalms, sang the old songs in Cherokee, slow and low, as she spun yarn by lantern light. She began carving again, small tokens from bone and driftwood, things to keep her hands busy while the silence worked its way through her ribs. One morning, she walked to the sycamore. The ground was hard, leaves frozen to its roots. She knelt there not to speak, but to listen. The creek chattered beside her, water brown with runoff. A cardinal flickered in the brush, red as flame. In the hush that followed, she thought of the cradle, the tiny bones beneath her knees, the man's rough voice saying safe. Snow fell, fine as sifted flour. When she returned to the cabin, she lit a fire and played the fiddle, the sound sharp and pure in the stillness. The music was less a song than a reckoning, each note a step backward, then forward again. Memory, yes, but not regret. Winter deepened. By the second month, she stopped counting the days. Time curled in on itself like bark under frost. She went to town once to trade tallow and smoked meat for flour. The sheriff nodded to her without words. Folks whispered, as they always had. She did not care. She found a letter tucked into her satchel when she returned. It was not signed, but she knew the hand, clumsy but earnest, as if each word had to be coaxed into the light. Testified, told what I could. Some listened, some turned away. Doesn't matter, the boy is safe. He's gone to stay with kin in Roanoke, a cousin with a farm. Said he'd write. I left before the frost. I'm coming home. Creek woman held the letter over the hearth until the edges curled black, but she did not drop it. She read it again by lamplight, then folded it into the back of her Bible, where the pressed violets lived. That night she slept dreamless. When he came, it was after a thaw. The ice had cracked loose in the creek, and the raccoons were stirring again in the brush. She heard his step before she saw him, distinct now, familiar, not the dragging shuffle of that first winter. He stood in the doorway with snow still in his hair, his coat stiff with wind. She did not rise, did not rush. Only looked at him, and in her stillness said what needed saying. He closed the door behind him and removed his boots, setting them beside hers. She made tea. They sat across from each other, with the fire crackling low, and the silence full of everything they'd not said. Then, without looking up, she began to speak. She told him of her father's hands, broad and cracked and always working, and how he'd taught her to read creek signs, how her mother had died quiet and young, how she'd left the hollow for marriage, for a man who loved order more than warmth, how the letters came from Richmond one spring and everything afterward turned to ash. She spoke until her voice thinned, until the words no longer scratched on their way out. And he listened. Not like one waiting to reply, but like someone holding the shape of her pain in his chest, giving it space. When the words were spent, he reached across the table and took her hand. And for the first time, she let him. Spring did not arrive with ceremony. It seeped in quiet, in the slow swelling of buds along the alder branches, in the pale green mist that gathered over the meadow at dawn. Frogs began to sing again in the dusk, tentative and sweet. The wind softened. The soil warmed. Creek woman and the man moved through the days like river and stone, different, but made for the same bend. They did not speak of what had passed between them by the hearth that night. They did not name the thing that now lived in the space between their silences, but it was there. He no longer flinched in sleep. He began carving again, this time not animals but useful things, a ladle, a new latch for the door, a comb she found one morning resting atop her folded shawl, her initials etched on the spine. She mended her old shawl in return, the one he wore when the mornings bit deepest. Stitched the seam he'd torn lifting the trapdoor one hard frost day. He never mentioned it, but he wore it every morning after. They worked the land together, him turning the earth with slow, deliberate strength, her planting seeds with the tenderness of ritual. Squash, beans, corn, the same trinity her mother had shown her once beneath a softer sun. One evening, she found him sitting by the creek with a book in his lap. It was her Psalms, dog-eared and faded. His finger traced the lines without sound, but his lips moved, forming the shapes slow and reverent. She sat beside him. He looked up only once and said, "There's a peace in this." She nodded. Not all scripture lives in books. He smiled at that, a crooked, weathered thing. Some of it lives in you. Later, as fireflies stitched the dusk and the air thickened with lilac and wood smoke, he brought her the bird. It was carved from maple, smooth as riverstone, its wings folded mid-glide. Not soaring, not fallen, just caught in that in-between place, still and steady. He set it in her hands without word. She understood. It was what they had become. Not saved, not broken. Held. That night they shared the bed. Not for heat, not for hunger, but for the ache of nearness, the rightness of skin against skin where words had long feared to live. He kissed her shoulder like a vow. She touched his brow like a benediction. They did not speak of love. But it was there, in the way he brushed her hair back before sleep, in the way she folded his shirt beneath his pillow each morning. Seasons passed. The boy wrote from Roanoke, his handwriting stronger now, full of pride. Said he was learning to write again, helping his cousin tend bees. Sent pressed flowers in the envelope, asked if he might visit come fall. They wrote back together, each adding a line, her script curved and spare, his blocky and deliberate. Creek woman stood by the sycamore again that spring, the air heavy with new bloom. She carried a small bundle wrapped in linen, lavender, dried honeycomb, a carving of a sparrow. She laid it by the roots and spoke the child's name aloud for the first time. Leela. The name hung there, soft and strong. The man stood behind her, saying nothing, but his hand found hers steady. Together they knelt. That night she played the fiddle, a tune of their own now, one born not of grief but of growing. She played until the stars burned through the smoke, until the trees bent close with listening. And as she played, he spoke again. Told her of a dream, of a house not made of timber but of sound, of footsteps in a hall, of laughter, of bread rising. She smiled, eyes closed. "I think," she said, voice thick with quiet joy, "we've already started building." When the fire dimmed and the music faded, they stood in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, watching the moon rise silver over the pines. Not everything needed a name. Some things were truer for it. And there in the hollow by the water's edge, two hearts long scattered by war and sorrow came to rest, not healed, but whole in their way. And the words they had buried once, beneath fear and time, had finally found root, spoken not in thunder, but in the daily choosing, in the reaching across silence. Not saved, but seen, and home at last,